In 1979, The Warriors was more than just a movie. It was chaos rebellion, and one of the most dangerous nights ever brought to the screen. A gang, trapped in a city that wanted to destroy them. Every subway train, every street corner, could be their last. But behind this legendary film lies a much darker story than you remember. Because one man, the face of madness, the voice you will never forget, Warriors, come out here and play, lived a life completely unworthy of the legend he created. And what really happened to him, the third character, is not what you think. James Remar as Ajax. He was the loudest, most unpredictable force in the Warriors, a man who seemed built from pure aggression, yet behind Ajax stood an actor whose real life would unfold with remarkable calm and quiet endurance. On screen, James Remar's Ajax was all instinct and volatility, a heavy muscle who thrived in chaos, throwing punches before questions, laughing in the face of danger. It was a performance that felt raw, almost too real, as if he had lived that life himself. But in truth, Remar came from a stable middle-class upbringing in Boston, the son of a lawyer and a mental health worker, a boy who decided at just 7 years old after watching Spartacus that he wanted to act. He trained seriously, moved to New York, and slowly carved his way into film with discipline rather than luck. Few realized that the iconic Ajax vest he wore became so personal that Remar kept it, carrying a piece of that character with him for decades. But what happens when an actor escapes the very role that defines him? Unlike many of his co-stars, Remar didn't fade or fracture. After the Warriors, he built a steady, respected career, 48 Hours, The Cotton Club, and years later a defining resurgence as Harry Morgan in Dexter, proving he was never just Ajax. Off-screen, his life followed a different script entirely. A marriage lasting over 4 decades, 2 children, and a deliberate distance from scandal or excess. By 2026, at 72, he remains active, grounded, and quietly successful, attending fan conventions while continuing to work. In a film filled with chaos and survival, it is perhaps the greatest irony of all. Ajax, the wildest soul of the night, belongs to the man who mastered something far rarer in Hollywood, a life that never needed saving. Number 2, Michael Beck as Swan. He was the quiet center of the storm, a leader who spoke less but carried more. And for a brief moment it seemed Michael Beck might carry Hollywood with him. In The Warriors, Swan moves with calm precision, a man who doesn't need to prove strength because he already understands it. While chaos erupts around him, he watches, calculates, and leads, guiding his gang through a city that wants them erased. It's that restraint, that stillness, that made Swan unforgettable. Yet long before the streets of New York, Beck's world was far quieter, raised on a family farm in the Arkansas Delta, shaped by open land rather than crowded sidewalks. He was an athlete, first earning a football scholarship to Millsaps College, until a single audition for Romeo and Juliet changed everything. Acting wasn't a dream he chased. It was something he discovered almost by accident, and then committed to fully studying in London and refining a craft built on discipline rather than ego. After The Warriors, Hollywood opened its doors. Then came Xanadu in 1980, a film that could have made him a star. Instead, it became a turning point. Not a collapse, but a quiet redirection. So what happens when someone walks away from the spotlight, while everyone else is running toward it? Beck chose steadiness over spectacle. He continued working television roles, narration, even returning to voice Swan decades later, but never chased fame at its loudest. Off-screen, he built something far more enduring, a marriage that has lasted since 1980, a private life in California, and a rhythm untouched by Hollywood's volatility. By 2026, at 77, he remains present, reflective, still connected to the legacy that defined him, but never confined by it. And perhaps that is Swan's final truth. The man who led others to safety was also the one who quietly led himself away from everything that could have consumed him. But what happens to the third character next may surprise you even more. Number 3. David Patrick Kelly as Luther. He didn't just play a villain, he created a moment that would outlive the film itself. In The Warriors, Luther is chaos distilled into a grin, a man who doesn't just threaten violence but seems to enjoy the idea of it. His voice, taunting and sing-song, cuts through the night with unsettling calm, turning a simple line into something unforgettable. Warriors, come out to play EA, a phrase that feels less scripted than summoned. And in truth, it was. David Patrick Kelly improvised it on set, tapping glass bottles together in a spontaneous rhythm that would echo across decades of pop culture. But long before that moment, Kelly's path was far from cinematic spectacle. Born in Detroit in 1951, the son of an accountant and decorated war veteran, he grew up in a world defined by discipline and structure. He graduated cum laude from the University of Detroit, drawn not only to acting but to music and theater, building his craft quietly away from fame. When the Warriors became a cult phenomenon, Kelly didn't chase stardom in the traditional sense. Instead, he moved fluidly between worlds, collaborating with directors like Spike Lee and David Lynch, appearing in Twin Peaks' Malcolm X, and later John Wick, while also composing and performing music, even contributing to a Grammy-winning soundtrack. So, how does someone create one of cinema's most iconic villains and never be consumed by it? Perhaps because Kelly was never just Luther. His life expanded rather than narrowed, grounded by family, marrying Juliana Francis in 2005, becoming a father and continuing to explore theater, film, and music with equal passion. By 2026, at 75, he remains active, respected, and quietly influential. A rare kind of artist who never needed reinvention because he was never confined to one identity. And somewhere in the distance, that haunting call still lingers, a reminder that sometimes the most lasting legends are born in a single unscripted moment. Number 4. Deborah Van Valkenburg as Mercy. In a film driven by violence, speed, and survival, she was the unexpected pause, the one presence that made the night feel human. As Mercy in The Warriors. Deborah Van Valkenburg didn't just play a companion. She brought a grounded defiance to a world dominated by men, a woman who refused to be ignored, who challenged Swan as much as she followed him. There was strength in her stillness, a quiet realism that softened the film's edges without ever weakening its tension. But long before she stepped into that role, Van Valkenburg was shaping a different kind of life. Raised in New York and trained as a visual artist at Pratt Institute, she earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts before ever facing a camera, originally drawn to painting, not performance. It was theater, most notably her time in the Broadway production of Hair, that slowly redirected her path, pulling her into acting with an instinctive, unpolished presence that would define her screen debut. Few realize that Mercy was her very first film role, a fact that makes her confidence on screen all the more striking. But what happens after a debut that quietly reshapes a film's emotional core? Rather than chasing blockbuster fame, she built a steady, enduring career, most notably in the sitcom Too Close for Comfort, while continuing to move between television, film, and stage. Her life off-screen remained private, creative, and grounded in Los Angeles, far from the noise of celebrity culture. By 2026, at 73, she continues to work, appearing at conventions and returning to the stage, still connected to the role that introduced her to the world. And perhaps that is Mercy's lasting truth. Sometimes the smallest presence leaves the deepest imprint, not by force, but by simply refusing to fade. Number 5. Marcelino Sanchez as Rembrandt. He was the youngest face in a night filled with danger, the quiet artist among warriors, and somehow the one who felt the most human. In The Warriors, Rembrandt doesn't lead fights or command attention. He observes, he creates. He leaves his mark in paint rather than violence. Marcelino Sanchez gave him a softness that stood in contrast to the chaos, a reminder that even in a world built on survival, there was still room for expression. But behind that gentle presence was a young man whose own life was just beginning to take shape. Born in Calle, Puerto Rico, and raised in the Bronx after his family moved when he was still a child, Sanchez grew up surrounded by the same urban landscape his character would later reflect. He entered acting without the backing of elite training or industry connections, finding his way in the late 1970s through persistence rather than privilege. Few knew that The Warriors was not just his breakout role, it was the moment that quietly opened doors he had only just begun to approach. After the film, his career gained momentum. He appeared in 3-2-1 Contact Chip's Hill Street Blues, and even 48 hours building a path that seemed steady, promising, and far from finished. But what happens when a future full of possibility is cut short before it can unfold? In the mid-1980s, Sanchez was diagnosed with AIDS at a time when understanding of the disease was limited and stigma was overwhelming. On November 21, 1986, at just 28 years old, he passed away in Los Angeles, only 7 years after. The Warriors introduced him to the world. Today, his story remains a quiet echo of a generation lost too soon. And perhaps that is Rembrandt's final mark, not just the art he left on screen, but the fragile reminder of how quickly brilliance can fade before it is fully seen. Number 6. Dorsey Wright as Cleon. He was the first to speak, the first to lead, and the first to fall a presence so commanding that even in his absence the entire journey of the Warriors carried his shadow. As Cleon Dorsey Wright embodied authority with effortless charisma, standing before hundreds of gangs and daring to imagine unity in a city built on division. There was confidence in his voice, urgency in his vision, and for a brief moment, it felt like he could change everything. But behind that powerful introduction was a young man from the Bronx, only 22 years old, stepping into his very first film role with no established career, no fame, and no guarantee of what would come next. Wright didn't come from a traditional acting background. He grew up surrounded by the raw, unfiltered reality of New York streets, the same world the film would later stylize, and found himself cast in The Warriors almost by chance. Few viewers realized that his iconic leopard skin do-rag wasn't just costume design. It became a lasting visual symbol of leadership in the film, instantly recognizable decades later. After the movie's success, opportunities followed. He appeared in Hair Ragtime and the Hotel New Hampshire, building a modest but promising career. But what happens when someone chooses stability over spotlight, when the path forward is clear but not desired? In the mid-1980s, Wright stepped away from acting and took a job with the New York Transit Authority, working for nearly 30 years in a role far removed from Hollywood. He continued voice work, and years later returned to fans through conventions and the 2005 The Warriors video game. By 2026, retired and in his late 60s, he lives a life defined not by fame, but by balance, reflection, and quiet pride. And perhaps that is Cleon's true legacy, not the leader who started a war, but the man who knew when to walk away from one. Number 7. Lynn Thigpen as the DJ. You never truly see her face, only a glimpse, a silhouette. But her voice becomes the spine of the entire night, guiding every step, every danger, every heartbeat of the Warriors. As the DJ, Lynn Thigpen doesn't chase attention, she controls it. Calm, deliberate, almost hypnotic, her voice transforms the film into something more than a story. It becomes a broadcast, a living pulse moving through the city. "This is the night," she says, and suddenly it feels like fate. But long before that voice echoed through radios on screen, Thigpen had already built a life in performance that was anything but invisible. Born in Joliet, Illinois, she found her way to the stage early, drawn to theater with a quiet determination that led her to Broadway, where she gained recognition in productions like Godspell. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was undeniable, steady, grounded, and deeply expressive. What makes her role in The Warriors so striking is how little of her is shown and yet how much she shapes. Few viewers realize that her performance relies almost entirely on voice alone, a choice that amplifies her impact rather than limits it. But what happens when a voice becomes more memorable than a face? For Thigpen, it became a signature. After the film, she continued a rich career across stage, television, and film, appearing in Lean on Me and becoming widely recognized as the chief in Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, bringing authority and warmth to a new generation. Then, in 2003, her story ended suddenly. At 54, she passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage, leaving behind a career defined not by spectacle but by presence. Today, her work still resonates, her voice still lingers. And perhaps that is her quiet legacy, the woman you barely see but never truly forget. Number 8. Roger Hill as Cyrus. For a single moment, he held the entire city in silence. One voice, one vision, one question that would echo far beyond the screen. Can you dig it? As Cyrus in The Warriors, Roger Hill embodied something rare in a world of chaos, authority with purpose, a leader who didn't just command fear, but inspired belief. Standing before thousands, he spoke not of violence, but of unity, imagining a future where gangs could become something greater. And yet that vision lasted only seconds before everything collapsed. Hill's presence felt larger than the film itself, but his path to that moment was grounded in theater, not spectacle. Born and raised in the Bronx, he studied at the City College of New York and built his craft on stage throughout the early 1970s, performing in off-Broadway productions and workshops that demanded discipline over fame. Few realize that his iconic speech in The Warriors carries the rhythm of a trained stage actor, measured, deliberate, almost musical in its delivery. But what happens when your most powerful moment is also your shortest? After the film, Hill chose to remain rooted in theater, continuing his work in productions like No Place to Be, Somebody, rather than pursuing mainstream Hollywood success. Years later, in 2005, he returned briefly to voice Cyrus in the Warriors video game, reconnecting with a legacy that had quietly grown in his absence. Then, in 2014, at 64, he passed away from a heart attack in his hometown of the Bronx. Today, his voice still lives on, sampled in music, remembered in culture. And somewhere in that echo, Cyrus is still asking the same question, waiting for an answer that never fades. Number 9. David Harris as Cochise. He didn't speak the loudest, but when Cochise stepped forward, you felt its strength without hesitation, loyalty without question. In The Warriors, David Harris embodied the kind of presence that didn't need attention to command it. With his distinctive style and quiet intensity, Cochise became the group's backbone in moments of chaos, a fighter who stood firm when everything else seemed to fall apart. There was something grounded about him, something real, as if he wasn't acting at all but simply revealing who he already was. Before the film, Harris had already begun carving out a path in acting, taking on smaller roles in the mid-1970s, building experience one step at a time. Raised in New York, he came from the same streets that inspired the film's world, bringing an authenticity that couldn't be taught. Few people realize that while many cast members were new to the screen, Harris entered The Warriors with just enough experience to anchor his performance in quiet confidence. But what happens when your most iconic role becomes the one that defines you for life? After the film, Harris continued working steadily, appearing in over 50 film and television roles across decades, though none would eclipse Cochise in cultural memory. Off-screen, his life remained deeply personal, centered around family, his daughter, grandchildren, and those closest to him. Then, in October 2024, at the age of 75, he passed away at home in New York after battling cancer. His fight didn't end on screen, and in the end, Cochise was exactly who he seemed to be, a man who stood his ground all the way to his final breath. Number 10. Thomas G. Waits as Fox. He was meant to guide them through the night, the sharp-eyed scout, quick-thinking and observant, yet his own journey inside. The Warriors ended before the story did. As Fox, Thomas G. Waits brought intelligence and subtle control to a world driven by impulse, a character who felt like the mind behind the movement. There was a quiet confidence in him, a sense that he saw things others didn't. But behind the scenes, that clarity turned into conflict. Born in Philadelphia in 1955, Waits had already built a serious foundation in acting. Studying at Juilliard and the Actors Studio, securing a 3-film deal with Paramount early in his career. He wasn't an outsider. He was a rising talent. Few realized that his departure from the Warriors wasn't scripted. It came after a disagreement with director Walter Hill, leading to his sudden removal mid-production. So what happens when an actor walks away from the very film that could define him? For Waits, it became a turning point, not an ending. He went on to appear in And Justice for All and The Thing, steadily building a career across film and Broadway, later evolving into a director, teacher, and musician. Years later, he expressed regret over asking to have his name removed from the Warriors, eventually reconciling with its legacy. By 2026, at 71, he continues to create, teach, and perform. And perhaps that is Fox's quiet truth, the one who disappeared from the story, never stopped writing his own. Number 11. Brian Tyler as Snow. He was the calm in a night built on chaos, the quiet strength that didn't demand attention but earned it. In The Warriors, Snow stands firm, composed, and disciplined, a fighter who doesn't rush into violence, but meets it with control. There's a steadiness to him, a sense that no matter how dangerous the journey becomes, he will hold the line. And perhaps that's what made him unforgettable. Not because he was the loudest, but because he never needed to be. Behind that presence was Brian Tyler, born in Detroit in 1953, a man shaped not by fame, but by discipline. Long before stepping onto a film set, he trained in martial arts, studying taekwondo and judo skills that would later give his performance a grounded physical authenticity. Unlike many actors chasing the spotlight, Tyler's path into the Warriors remains understated, with little fanfare before or after. Few realize that much of Snow's controlled fighting style wasn't choreographed in the traditional sense. It came from Tyler's real-life training, adding a layer of realism that quietly anchored the film's action. But what happens when someone walks away from Hollywood not out of failure, but by choice? After a handful of smaller roles, Tyler left acting behind and chose a different kind of duty, becoming a New York State Trooper. He retired in 2004, stepping away from public life with the same quiet consistency that defined his career. By 2026, in his early 70s, he occasionally reconnects with fans at conventions, a reminder of a role that never truly faded. And in the end, Snow remains exactly who he was, steady, resilient, and unwavering both on screen and beyond it. Number 12. Terry Mikos as Vermin. He was the loudest voice in the room, always talking, always chasing something more. Yet his life would eventually move in the opposite direction, towards something quieter, steadier, and far more grounded. In The Warriors, Vermin is restless, impulsive, and often humorous, the kind of character who breaks tension just when it becomes unbearable. Terry Mikos gave him a raw, almost unscripted energy, making him feel less like a performer and more like someone you might actually meet on the street. But behind that chaotic charm was a young man from Poughkeepsie, New York, stepping into his first major role without the weight of expectation or a clear path ahead. Few people realize that after the film, Michos never fully committed to the Hollywood machine. He took on a handful of roles, including The Great Skycopter Rescue and appearances on television, but something shifted. So what happens when someone walks away from the very dream others are still chasing? For Michos, it became a redirection, not a retreat. He moved into communications, working as a news director and anchor, earning recognition for his work, before eventually stepping into something even more personal, serving his community through ministry. By 2026, at 72, he lives a life centered on faith, family, and service, working as a pastor and church administrator while still occasionally reconnecting with fans of the Warriors. And in the end, Vermin's story carries a quiet truth: the man who always wanted more found it not in fame, but in purpose. What makes a legend? Fame, survival, or the choices made after the spotlight fades? The cast of the Warriors didn't just live one story. They lived many. Some chased Hollywood, some walked away, some never got the time they deserved. So tell me, who do you think had the most powerful journey and why? Was it the ones who stayed, or the ones who left? And what story should we uncover next? Another classic film, or a hidden life behind a familiar face? If these stories made you see classic Hollywood differently, stay with Legends of Classic Hollywood, because the real stories are only getting deeper.